like how, in which direction have you been working in that? Because it's a
Right.
field that it will come up very, very strong, even more after the whole situation, I think.
Okay, so you can introduce me and you can ask me for a little more background about myself, if you'd like, and then I can tell you that what courses I taught and what my
That would
research.
be wonderful, actually, if you want to tell me a little bit more of how long have you been in the university, first of all?
I was on campus for 20 years at the University of Arizona in Tucson. For 1 year before that, I worked at Texas A&M University. And in between, on sabbatical leaves or as part of visiting scholar programs, I was at the University of California at Berkeley. I was at Grinnell College, which is a small liberal arts college in Iowa. I was at Southern Utah University, where I was the Eccles visiting scholar. So, and in between there, I worked for the Nature Conservancy, a large nonprofit organization worldwide. I worked for them for a year, setting up their postdoctoral program.
So how was it like when you started your career, and how is it now in terms of what we know about preservation of the planet?
Well, a few things. First of all, it was a really long time ago when I started graduate studies. I started graduate school in 1983.
It means that you have a much bigger understanding of the course of the earth. You know, if it was like 5 years, it's not such a big difference.
Well, we didn't have these things,
Of course.
you know, and it wasn't that long ago before everybody had one of these things. So the ability to communicate almost instantly with anybody anywhere in the world has made a profound difference in people's ability to communicate, as well as to conduct research, primarily secondary research. So I did most of my research in the field. I was out grubbing around and digging up plants and planting other plants and manipulating the environment and so on. I was a field biologist, a field ecologist. And almost nobody does that kind of work anymore. In fact, even when I was doing it, I was among the last people who were doing that because it's just so expensive. And so I established very intimate personal relationships with my graduate students, because when you work in the field with somebody for 12 to 15 hours a day, and you're all hot and hungry and sweaty and thirsty most of the time, you develop this sort of bond that you don't get, say, interacting in a classroom or even in a laboratory. So I developed these very close relationships with my graduate students and with the occasional undergraduate student or technician as well. And so that was really important for me. I learned a lot from my students, including graduate students and undergraduate students. And I particularly learned about the importance of something called empathy in my latter years at the University of Arizona. So from about 2005 until 2009, when I left active service, I was teaching poetry at incarceration facilities, the juvenile detention facility and the county jail. So that allowed me to interact with people that most professors don't interact with. We'll put it that way. Instead of, and my honors course came to be part of a program called Poetry Inside Out, with the inside being various incarceration facilities and the outside being students like my honor students. So I would require my honor students to go into the juvenile detention facility and interact with people who were almost the same age, but had had very dissimilar upbringings. So there's a bunch of privileged, mostly upper middle class Caucasian people in the honors program. And in the juvenile detention facility, it was 95% were Hispanic girls that I was interacting with. And it was almost all Hispanic kids, male and female, who were in the juvenile detention facility. So it was really quite a contrast in terms of the demography and also the upbringing. And so they learned a lot from each other. The juvenile detainees almost every time we were there, once a week, one of them would pull me off to the side and say, I think I'm as smart as these honors students. Do you think maybe I could go to college? And so I would encourage them to do so. And we had a one question exit questionnaire when we would leave. Anytime there was an honor student who was new to the program and new to the detention facility, we'd go outside, clear security, and sit on a park bench for a few minutes. And we would just ask, what did you think? And the honor student would be very thoughtful, and they'd think for a minute or two, and then they'd almost always, they would say the same thing or something very similar to this. They would say, those girls are just like me. And so here we have upper middle class Caucasian kids in their early 20s interacting with 15, 17-year-old Hispanic kids who most people would consider real losers because they're in this detention facility. And the honor students would think for a minute and they'd say, they're just like me. So that was inspiring for me.
That's very inspiring, actually, because also it has been a question from my side, how do we actually raise empathy? Because I have been realizing that empathy is actually the foundation. And funnily enough, it's very connected to the earth also. So the earth element has this ability for some reason to activate your empathy sensors. I don't know how to call them, but the thing is, like, when we get disconnected from the earth, how can we create other forms of having this empathy?
Right. I think empathy is the most difficult thing to teach. I'm not sure it can even be taught.
That's exactly the point, yeah.
I think it can be learned, but it has to be learned one person at a time. And so what I was doing as a teacher was trying to create the conditions under which people could learn empathy. And I think I succeeded in a variety of cases, but there's no guarantee there that, and as you point out, we've got something that has been called nature deficit disorder. We have so few people who are willing or able to go outside and interact with Mother Earth. Instead, we have, to a very large extent, a population, at least in the so-called Western world, which includes Western Europe and the United States and Japan, we have people who are raised in the city and have spent very little time in the out of doors, much less in wild native ecosystems.
Exactly. And I have been realizing that it's really affecting more deeply the system, and you have a much wider range of this feeling of disconnection the more you have been away from nature, right? But most of the people right now, they don't really have the luxury to go back to nature. There is a big wave of people really interested to go back, right? That, like, it has been changing a lot.
Yes, there are a lot of people who are stuck in jobs, who are stuck in the city because that's where the jobs are. So they live in big cities. It's very difficult to get outside, and most cities were not designed with nature in mind. A few are exceptional, the Central Park in New York, obviously, and Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. So there are places that you can go to sort of get away, but it's always been difficult from city life. And it's worse now because so many places are locked down in one way or another.
Absolutely. And I think that everybody can feel like these effects. I can definitely feel it myself a lot. Also with the extended use of technology, instead of going to nature, we just use technology. And
we all have these smartphones now, and they have become our boss. They tell us when we can do things because we are so hyper connected now, and we want to remain that way. And people feel disappointed if you don't respond to their message right away. It's crazy. So I try to take a walk here. There are 3 city parks near where I live in Central Florida. So I can walk from this rental house, and I can take about a 3-mile walk. And it's very nice. There are 2 lakes and a canal that connects them, and a lot of native trees, and even the occasional alligator, along with bird life. So I feel very privileged that I'm able to do that and take advantage of that every single day. But a lot of people aren't in that position. You know, they're working at home, unable to get away. They're working at a workplace, unable to get outside. And I think that's unfortunate for us. And it's certainly unfortunate for ecosystems that depend upon some level of human understanding if we're going to preserve any of them. We've been terrible about that.
This is also a very interesting point that I am really having difficulty to understand how can we be so cruel with nature? How we really can treat nature so in such a way, you know? So what is your point of view about that?
Until you become familiar with and maybe even love something, anything, I don't think you're going to go to any great effort to try to preserve it or protect it. And because we have a society that is largely raised, largely grows up in cities, there is a disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
When I lived in Tucson, Arizona for about 20 years, and I lived in a little tiny house, 1,100 square feet on a 4,000 square foot suburban lot. But right outside the door was the Sonoran Desert. And so I could go out the door, and my dog insisted that I do go out the door twice a day, once in the morning and then once in the evening.
They never forget, right? They're completely connected. They never forget.
Exactly. And so I could walk in the Sonoran Desert every day, and I did twice a day. And from my home in suburban Tucson, I could walk all the way to the Colorado River near Yuma, Arizona, several hundred miles if I wanted to. I never did. And never go across a road, never go across a paved road. And so I was in this, even though I was in a city of more than 1 million people, I was fortunate to have this tiny house that bordered the Sonoran Desert and allowed me to go outside every day. But a lot of people don't look for those opportunities because of the way we're raised in this society to believe that these ecosystems are not that important. You know, most people think that the water comes out of the tap. They don't understand that it actually comes from somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. That's true. The thing is, like, how many people, it's always the same, right? We always say that we would like to be more conscious and preserve the earth better, but in the end, nobody really wants to change their habits either. So how do we create this culture that it's actually important, or even further, it's even pleasant to preserve? So it's like something that becomes our priority.
Right. That's a great question, and something that I tried to encourage and facilitate for those 21 years in the classroom and even beyond. And I'm uniformly unsuccessful. I don't know how to get students to love nature. I don't know how to get individuals to love nature, except for creating experiences that people love to do. So I would drag my students out in the field all the time. And initially they didn't like it because most of them went to an urban high school where they had basically never been off the sidewalk before.
Yeah.
And it's uncomfortable going out and interacting with nature, right? There's things that bite you, things of all sizes that bite you, and you sweat, and it's uncomfortable, and you're thirsty, and you're hungry, and you can't turn to a coffee shop 20 feet away. And so it takes some time to become familiar with how to live in the out of doors. You know, a friend of mine, Doug Peacock, who's an outstanding writer and an inspiring human being, he tells me and other people that until he's been walking away from people, walking in the wilderness for at least 3 days, he still feels superior up till that point. He still feels like he's a human who's superior to the ecosystem. But once he's been walking in the ecosystem for 3 days without seeing other human beings, he realizes that he is a human animal, and he's just one of many animals that are in this ecosystem, and he doesn't feel so superior anymore. Most of us don't have time to take 3 days off to walk in the wilds and then spend another 10 days feeling like you're part of this ecosystem and that you're not superior. So I'm not sure how we get to 7.8 billion informed, empathetic people in a short period of time.
Absolutely, it's not the easiest thing ever. But what I am saying that is happening due to the whole situation right now is that people become more sensible. And I feel that nature, for some reason, needs this kind of sensibility in order for you to be able to understand it. So the plants have different rhythms. They're not that fast. They're not a notification that arrives like in milliseconds. They do have need time. And and to tell you the truth, I have seen that also for some reason, growing older, you start getting more interested into nature. So, like when you're in your early 20s, it's completely different when you're in your early 30s, or your early 40s, your early 50s, etc. So, it might mean that also your circles need to become longer to be able to understand nature circles, right? Like you have to see some circles happening to understand that this thing is alive somehow.
Absolutely. Gardeners know. People who are growing food in their own garden, they know about the seasons. And they know that a potato requires more than a 5-minute trip to the grocery store. That potato actually came from somewhere, and they know about the seasons. And so that's one of many ways to get outdoors and begin observing what is happening with so-called natural cycles, right? The spring, the summer, the fall, and so on. And there are many other ways to do that. You can do that by becoming a competent hiker and just spend your time out there. You can become a bird watcher, somebody who just keeps track of the birds and how they change through the year. You can make observations yourself. Almost anywhere you live, you can find some native organisms that you can focus on. And Henry David Thoreau did that very thing when he was living in his cabin in the woods for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. And he recorded the first date of flowering for every species there. He recorded when the first flower emerged for every single plant species. And interestingly enough, a couple 100 years later, 150 years later, that information served as the basis for a comparative study. Somebody went in and did the same thing and found that probably because of the warming planet, the seasons have changed as far as the plants are concerned. And so here's Henry David Thoreau just out there on his own by Walden Pond, watching the sun come up and go down over Walden Pond every morning, and just recording these observations of his that turned out to be important later on, far after he was gone from the planet.
Yeah, I was surprised to learn that to actually make a proper study about the permaculture site, you can start automatically, but you're gonna need at least like 2 years to be able to actually really understand the place, and that it needs personal observation. Doesn't that you cannot only do it only with studies. You really have to stand outside at the same spot every day and observe it yourself and understand how the sun is moving, and really get your own feedback from nature about what it needs and how it's working.
You're absolutely right. And I created a homestead in rural southern New Mexico many years ago when I left active service at the University of Arizona. And I learned so much from the changes in season and the impacts on the organisms there, but I learned a lot more from my neighbors. So the other thing it's important to pay attention to is the people who have gone before. You don't have to rediscover every single wheel.
Totally, yeah. And we are looking a lot into permaculture right now because our very first location that hopefully will open in June, it's about permaculture. So very it was kind of expected that the very first thing that needs to get attention right now is the earth, of course. So
Mhm.
it didn't come as a surprise. But it's always there are these terms that the people who know about them are extremely interested, like permaculture and biomimicry. The people who don't, they really have no idea of what it is. Like it's too far away. And I have to admit that I was one of the second category of the people, right? I had no idea what permaculture means. I was realizing it has something to do with cultivation of plants, but that was kind of all, right? And at some point I got to see and to watch and to learn more about it. And it's an amazing design system, you know?
Right.
And and only then it started becoming interesting because I didn't even know that we have gone so deep into understanding like how we can imitate the design process that nature uses. But in which extent do you think that we are successful in this path?
Well, even Bill Mollison, one of the founders of permaculture from Australia, admitted that it had failed a few years ago. And I think he was talking about failing in terms of a large scale societal endeavor because not enough people got involved, not enough people were practicing permaculture. I don't think that Mollison would claim that it failed for him.
Mm.
He was remarkable, and many other permaculturists have done remarkable work. My partner Pauline is certified as a permaculturist, and I taught the principles of permaculture in my courses. But there are a few of us. As you indicated, you even use the term permaculture. You use that word with people, and they sort of shake their head and wonder what you're talking about. It has not, Bill Mollison was right in that it didn't spread widely enough so that now everybody is as familiar with permaculture as they are with, for example, who is the best football player, who is the best basketball. Everybody knows the celebrities, but nobody knows the things that really matter, which is taking care of the soil and taking care of the ecosystems.
Totally. But do you feel that what is happening right now might create a shift towards um, at least an interest or a deeper look towards nature? Do you feel that this might happen, or do you don't really believe that could be the direction?
I think that it's happening for a lot of people right now. A lot of people who have been communicating with me have indicated that they are spending more time outside, if only because they have to. They don't have a job to go to anymore. So they read books, they spend all the time on the internet playing video games, or they go outside and interact with the natural world. Had something like the pandemic occurred many years ago, I think it would have been great. And in fact, something like a pandemic did occur many years ago. When I was growing up in a very small town in northern Idaho, we had the equivalent of a pandemic. We
Oh,
didn't
really?
have we didn't have any money to go anywhere. So we had to stay right there, and the kids had to play with other kids and interact with actual human beings. And I spent most of my days of my childhood wandering around with other kids, riding bicycles and going into the woods and getting to understand the pulse of nature by climbing trees and playing in streams and doing all kinds of activities that were immersed in nature. And my parents, it was a safer time. My parents didn't think anything of me being gone, just be home before dark. Well, in the summertime, it didn't get dark until 9 o'clock at night. And so we'd be out until 9 o'clock at night. And all the neighbors knew that those kids are the McPherson kids, and they're with the Wilson kids, and they're with and so on. So it was really difficult to get in trouble. It was sort of like a pandemic when I was growing up, except we didn't have smartphones.
Maybe better.
Absolutely. Because we were forced by the system really to go outside. We had no television when I was very young, and then later we got one station and it wasn't very good and it was black and white, and so who wanted to watch that? It was just more fun to be outside,
Was it
playing cowboys
then,
and Indians and chasing each other around as kids.
was it then that you started being interested about working with nature, or what triggered this interest?
Well, it's really interesting because I didn't even think about it. obviously, I was immersed in it every single day. Also, my parents were school teachers, so we were poor, and gasoline was very inexpensive. So I spent fall days hunting. We would go out hunting wild game, and in the summer we would go fishing, and we would eat hundreds of little trout that we caught in these streams over the course of a year. And typically typically a deer or two, because both my parents had licenses, and then sometimes an elk as well. So I ate almost no domestic meat until I went to college. So I was just out there. And then as an undergraduate, I picked up a summer job as a firefighter on a helitack crew. So I'd be transported to the fires in these helicopters. And my supervisor was later to be my housemate when I went to undergraduate school, and he pushed me towards majoring in forestry, and he was getting a master's degree in forestry at the time. So we shared a house, the two of us and another guy. And so it was a pretty easy transition for me from being a kid outdoors, then being a wildland firefighter, being outdoors, and then studying the importance of fire in forested ecosystems. And it all just sort of rolled into one cohesive matrix that became my life.
Yeah, I can understand it. It was just a natural way of natural evolution, let's say, somehow. And I don't know if you have family or kids, and I don't know if they are interested in nature, but I kind of feel that we have to start like finding ways to bring people back, that they are connected somehow what they already know. So like kind of take them from where they are and bring them back. It's just it always feels that technology and nature don't really go together. Like I was very surprised the other day to learn that maybe it's an assumption, but I think it's quite based assumption that the extinction of the bees might have been because of the electromagnetic field of mobile phones raising. And I was really shocked actually, and it kind of totally makes sense in a way. So how can we actually create this balance? So I have been thinking, how do I can even create tech that is more aligned and it's actually helpful to us and to nature instead of being opposite?
Well, I think we can only do that one person, one family at a time. And I think we're too late at this point for doing that. I think that we have been transforming the natural world into cities and what we call resources for so long that we're at the end of the line. When I was a kid growing up in Weippe, Idaho, it was big timber country. There were 3 large sawmills in the town of 700 people where I lived. And the trees were 8 or 10 feet in diameter at the base. And I visited 2 or 3 years ago. I went back to that place, and there's almost no tree bigger than this now. They're 8 inches in diameter. The sawmills are gone. The people are gone. There's not 700 people living there. There's 400 people living there now. The elementary school and the middle school that I went to are closed. And it's just all the jobs dried up. So we've been so busily converting the natural world into cities and technology so that we can have communications like this one, that we lost sight of the most important part, which is retaining the natural ecosystems and paying attention to the species and treating them like relationships instead of like resources. When you treat the white-tailed deer like you're in a relationship with the white-tailed deer, instead of treating the white-tailed deer like it's some kind of resource that a certain number of people can remove a certain number of those animals each year and so on. It's a completely different way of looking at the world. And because we've had nature deficit disorder for so long, I just don't see a way back except one person at a time. And with 7.7 or 7.8 billion people on the planet, I just don't see us going back that way at this point. We're too far down the wrong road.
What do you think that somebody could do in their own house, maybe, or in their own family, or in their own garden to prevent that, or at least start going a little bit on the other direction?
Well, right, and I'm a huge fan of what Buddhists would call pursuing right action, doing the right thing and not be attached to the outcome. So I try to live a life that has a relatively small footprint, ecological footprint, not just carbon footprint. My partner is a gardener, so we got a big garden established on this rental property. If the owner comes and sees how much of the lawn we've torn up, she might not be all that impressed. We've converted into potatoes and peas and beans and zucchini instead of a monoculture of a lawn. And we like to interact not only with the garden, but with the birds, with the other organisms that are attracted to something besides a grass lawn with Kentucky bluegrass or whatever. So can we do that? Yes. And I would encourage everybody to spend as much time as they can out of doors in something resembling the natural world. And that's why I take my 2 walks every day to go to the nearby parks. And I generally don't see anybody. And when I do, it's always the same 10 people who are out there walking their kids in a stroller or their dog on a leash. And it's really interesting because not that long ago, like about 2 months, I would see people and I would stop and have a chat with them, just talk for a little bit about being new to the area and so on. Now, people look at you and they're trying so hard to maintain social distancing in this community that people see me and they just go like this. They run away. Like, I can't get within 10 feet of that person or I'm going to die from COVID-19. It's really funny. And yet not funny. So that at the same time that people are spending time outdoors, we're now avoiding human contact in the outdoors. That's one of the outcomes of this coronavirus crisis.
Absolutely, but I have also seen the opposite. That many people, because they cannot have human contact, they go and have a lot more contact with the nature, because right now it's kind of the place where it's safe, right? Somehow, which is very interesting analogy to see that we needed like a global attack of a virus to understand that nature is not our enemy.
Right. Yes. We needed a virus to remind us that getting outdoors isn't necessarily a bad thing. And also, there's information about the ultraviolet light destroying the virus and getting out in the sun for that reason. So the good news is that maybe the virus is forcing some people to get outside, probably for the wrong reason, out of fear, but maybe they'll learn to love the outdoors and spend more time as a consequence.
Exactly, and I think it's pushing a lot in that direction anyhow. Like, it's pushing into understanding also our needs, because that's a big part of putting everything down into resources, is because we had too many needs. Like, we were needing all the time something.
Right.
Somehow. So it had to be fast and it had to be convenient. It had to be efficient, because if not, it was not enough ever.
Right, and that's the whole story of civilization, is what kind of convenience can I get next? And so every little convenience turns into something that we take for granted.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't that long ago that to call somebody on the phone, you had to stand next to the phone, you had to dial it. It just wasn't that long ago. And now, of course, you take the phone everywhere. One of my former students told me that he got one of these Apple Watches for his phone because that was the only way he could set his phone down and walk away from it, is if he had something so somebody could call him in case of an emergency. And his job had become so important to him and the people around him that he could not walk away from his phone for more than 30 seconds.
Wow.
What a crazy world.
Uh-huh. And it's the reality for many people. It has been the reality for me for some periods of time also. Like I have experienced that, and I remember also that that creates an addiction. So even after, because really few people will continue with this amount of work for a very long period of time. But the problem is that even if you stop having so much of work, you will still have the addiction of go and check your phone. So you will just replace it with something else.
Right. Excuse me, I need to check my phone now. Can I get back to you?
I think they're writing to me also.
I think I just heard an email come in. It's probably really important.
Let's get back to the garden, though. You have set a small as garden where you're living right now. How long did it take you? How much food can it give? Like, how doable is that? Like everybody to do in their small garden anywhere they are.
Well, during World War II in the United States, home gardens provided about 50% of the food for families.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
That's
Okay.
a tremendous amount. So I don't think we can do that anymore because there's way more people in the United States than there were during World War II, and the soils have been destroyed. And so nothing from the perspective of the natural world, the soils and the precipitation regimes and the nutrients in the soils and so on, nothing is the same. Nothing is as good as it was in World War II, but that's still no reason to not grow a little bit of your own food. Talk about conducting an activity that causes you to appreciate the natural world. There is nothing like eating food that you have grown yourself to remind you that we are connected to planet Earth and that we can have a relationship with the Earth that ends up with the best tasting radish you've ever had in your life or the best tasting carrot or whatever. So my partner is really the senior management here. She's in charge of what gets planted and so on, but she's probably got 40 different varieties out there, everything from beans and peas to squash and carrots, just an enormous array. This does not mean, of course, that we're going to be able to feed ourselves based on what we grow in the garden. Those days are behind us, at least on a small property like this one. But there's still enormous gratitude that I experience when eating something that I had some hand in growing. And I did that for about 10 years when living off grid in New Mexico and then in Western Belize. Eating food that I helped grow is a source of great gratitude. Like I did this along with the earth. I did this. I got this seed. I put it in the ground. I watered. I weeded. I took care of it. And there's nothing quite like that in my experience.
I can imagine. I mean, after all, it's all about where we were putting our attention that will give us the satisfaction after, right? It's all about attention in the end of the game. And I would like to hear a little bit more about your experience about living off grid. So how was it? How was the conditions, and which were the difficulties? Which were, because I feel that there will be a new type of off grid coming up. There's many people who are interested in creating different types of communities that are a hybrid between off and on grid. So nobody wants to get it completely disconnected, but everybody needs to be a little bit disconnected somehow. So it's like finding this balance between the two.
Right. And, I would argue that very few people have the opportunity to go fully off grid. It's a very difficult thing to accomplish. I did it only because I had spent a long time in a partnership with a woman who felt that it was important to live frugally. So we almost never ate dinner outside of our own home. We didn't party on the weekends. We lived on about a third of our combined income and saved the rest for the proverbial rainy day. And so we were able to create this incredible infrastructure to live off grid that provided the solar panels, provided all the electricity we needed, and we had 2 solar pumps and a hand pump to get water out of the ground from a very shallow location. Pretty decent soils so that we could grow an enormous amount of food. We also had chickens and ducks and turkeys and a goose and goats and so on. So a lot of sources of food, different kinds of food, and also an arrangement that had us staying there on the property for really long periods of time, because it's impossible to leave if you have non-human animals that you're taking care of. You can't leave goats for a week and expect to come back and get milk out of them the next morning. So you establish this relationship with non-human organisms, domestic and non-domestic, living in that sort of situation. And so I lived full-time a little over 7 years in New Mexico, and the most important, and an additional 2 years where I was just there part-time. And I learned quite quickly the most important thing was my neighbors, and that interaction that I developed, the sense of community, was all important, because they had been through the things I was trying to go through. They knew how to put a seed in the ground and a couple months later have a carrot come out of the ground. And I didn't know those things. So
Yeah, in Greece we have a phrase that we say, first your neighbor, then God. So it's more important to have a good relationship with your neighbor.
That's great. Yes, that's exactly right. And then Western Belize was a completely different environment. I went from a very arid situation in New Mexico, where water was the limiting factor essentially all the time, to Western Belize up in the Maya Mountains, where it rained very, very frequently. And that was, precipitation was the least of our issues in terms of growing food.
And it changes completely the whole equation of what can you grow and how fast and how much, right?
Exactly. And there again, tapping into local knowledge was important. And it was in Belize that my partner completed her permaculture certification experience. So she had that local knowledge starting off. But, community, that's the whole story. And the technical details tend to work themselves out if you can be interacting with people who know what they're doing.
Exactly. So I see that Pauline is writing that if everyone grew a tiny amount of squash and pumpkin, people might be able to go through the hard times that are coming. And I do believe that we have to actually start thinking a little bit further, that this situation might last a little bit longer than we were expecting, and maybe we have to start taking care of our own food, because the supply chain it is already interrupted, and it will continue to be for some time. So I would love you to like, what could be possible to grow, and in smaller scales inside apartments, or in bigger scales, and how do we maybe self-organize to use bigger parts of the land? Because in many countries, for example, here in Pakistan, it's not that their land doesn't exist, it's that just there's a lot of land that is unused for many reasons.
Right.
So how do we shift that?
Well, you're dead on. Just a day or two ago, the chairman of Tyson Foods said the supply chain is breaking.
Of course.
And this is not
far away our food,
right. This is not an admission he wanted to make willingly, obviously. So where are we going to get our food? Everybody can grow a little bit, and it really doesn't take that. If I learned to do it as a lifelong academic, and I did within a couple of years, I learned how to grow enough food for a few people year round. So I learned how to store the food. I learned how to can the food and dry the food and make cheese and so on. So if a lifelong academic who is all in his head can learn how to do that and grow enough food to feed people pretty much year round, with the exception of grains, because grains are so area intensive, then I would argue that almost anybody can do that in a relatively short period of time. It's going to take a growing season or two, and it's going to take communication with your neighbors. I was hosted on tour years ago by a woman who I still communicate with. She must be in her late 70s or early 80s, and she's basically a lifelong gardener. And she's been gardening basically her entire life at various places around the planet. And now she's in the Pacific Northwest. When I met her on tour, she picked me up in her car and was taking me to her home where I was going to stay for a few days. And she says, as she's driving, she says, "I didn't really believe you until this year. And this year, well, I have 3 varieties of cherry trees, early, middle, and late. And this year they all ripened before early. And," she says, "I always get 2 cuttings of my arugula." Arugula is one of the greens. And she says, "I always get 2 cuttings. This year it all bolted. I didn't get any arugula this year." So this is somebody who's paying attention to the seasons, to the cycles, because she has to. And it just slapped her in the face that suddenly the environment was very different than it had been for the many other years she had been gardening. And so it's important to pay attention and to communicate with people like her who actually know what's going on in the world. And she learned her way through it. So here we are, it must be 5 years later, and she's still growing food, a lot of food. Again, she's on a small property, so she can't grow the grains that she needs for her own life, but she interacts with her neighbors and trades with her neighbors, gives them the surplus, and she gets the surplus from them, and so on. And that sort of mentality, I think, is going to have to start coming into play, or we're all going down together, and it's going to be a really ugly process of going down. If we're fighting over the last carrot, that doesn't bode well for humanity.
Absolutely. But it's also what you say, like, we have to know and communicate what are you planting, what am I planting, because we are planting exactly the same. Our surpluses are exactly the same.
Yes.
And then we are creating like the same problems that we have been creating now. So we have to start really understanding why we even able to collaborate, right, as human beings, and what we could create all of us together, and how we can do it. And I think nature is a great example for that.
And, there's so much we can learn from the living planet, and so much we can learn from each other along the way. This does not have to be a miserable experience, this growing food. It can be a beautiful experience and make you feel like you have accomplished something at the end of the day when you bite into the first carrot you've ever grown.
I am seeing that people are already really liking it, so I'm very glad to see that people are getting actually very interesting about the land and about the earth and about growing food in a different way, because it's important. If we don't get interested about that, it will not change ever. So
Right.
we are getting closer to our time, but I would like you to, if you have something that you would like to share before we close, I'd be very, very happy to hear.
Oh, I think it was Edward Abbey who had a significant influence on me when I was younger. I think it was Edward Abbey who wrote, "What am I trying to say? The same as before, nothing more than that." Maybe with an everything thrown in there too. And so thank you for the opportunity to converse in this way and for keeping track of the time and so on. No matter how much time we have left, I would encourage people to spend a significant amount of time, if they're able at all, in the wildest environment they can find. I have long encouraged people to do that in my classes and beyond. And I recognize that it's very difficult for some people because of their set of living arrangements. It's if you live in Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan, it's difficult to get into the Catskills every weekend and immerse yourself in nature. I understand that. But on the other hand, most of us probably have more opportunities before us than we recognize.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
there are several parks within a short walk from me right here, and I take advantage. I go out there and enjoy them. And yes, there are people with babies and strollers. And yes, there are dogs running around off leash and jumping on me all the time. And these are minor inconveniences that are worth putting up with so that I can interact with the trees and the birds.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I would be happy if we continue the communication as we are setting our first permaculture location in France, and that would be one of the very first things that will come up. It would be lovely to share it with you and have your opinion about it. And I was saying that Pauline was saying that she was starting a course, so the video program for folks starting. I love their own gardening. Okay, so it's about gardening. So everybody, so it would be great to connect with her to see what she's
Right.
doing. So,
Right. You need to talk to her next. Like I said, two things. She's senior management and she's permaculture certified. I'm not.
beautiful. I will connect. I think I found her on Facebook. I don't know. I'm not sure if you understand this comment. Probably you know Jeffrey. It is painful. I missed the opportunity to move to rural Maine last year. Okay, take number 2. I'm trying again. Much more challenging this year.
And Jeffrey is pointing out that the world has changed in a year. The world has changed in what, 6 weeks?
Exactly.
Is a completely different place than it was 2 months ago.
Yeah.
In ways that most people were unable to foresee. And I talk to Jeffrey now and then and remind him that the world has changed, that the universe does not adhere to our expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Life is funny that way. We have things we want to do and we think we're going to get them done. And then suddenly the universe takes a turn on us. Well, life's like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your really beautiful answers. I love to start talking about the earth because it needs activation. It's desperately asking for us to listen, So we better start listening because if not, we will be paused again, to say it like in that way. And
Right.
it will be good to have more interaction in the future. And I will talk with Pauline and bring her on because I find that both of you are doing beautiful work and it has to be recognized.
Thank you. I appreciate the conversation very much.
Thank you so much. Have a beautiful day for you, right? Or what time is it there?
Yes, it's 5 o'clock.
Okay, you still have some day left.
Maybe 6. I don't know. There's lots of daylight left. Yes. I'm going to the park after this. Take my walk.
Well, enjoy that. Thank you so much. Bye.